Allow me to introduce your moderator for the last panel. Is none other than Dr. Korir, Principal Secretary, State Department of Foreign Affairs, who will lead us in this session. A round of applause, please, for Dr. Korir.
Thank you, good sir.
All right.
Hello, everybody in? I know it's the graveyard season, like it's one of the very last panels, and so I know you guys have worked very hard, but let's give it a final, strong, like Kenyan marathoners, Let's give it the final mile. Let this be the most powerful and energetic panel, all right? Let's do that. Okay, good. So let me just call my panelists. We have my friend, Dr. Elizabeth Carabin. Elizabeth, you may sit closest to me if that's okay. Dr. Linda Ogalo. Linda is here. You may sit at the very end, Linda, if that's okay. And then we have Dr. Prosper. I like the name. When your first name is Prosper. That's like so cool. And then we have, do we have another seat? Looks like it's gonna be a tidy one. Do we have Dr. Kenduywa in the room? All right, good. This is a packed panel. So the last panel was really interesting, and I think it ended at a very, sort of a very difficult dilemma in a way. I think, and thank you very much, Otila, for that, for your submissions. But in closing, Professor Sifuna mentioned what I thought was something very interesting, that we are dealing with the atmosphere being a global commons. You know, and part of the challenge with the global commons, or a commons, is this whole idea of the tragedy of the commons. You know, presented by Professor Hardin many years ago, and went on to then suggest that commons are always susceptible to being overused. There are people who benefit from commons disproportionately, and they really don't care too much about the costs of it because they're benefiting. There is a serious free riding problem that one deals with in relation to commons, and yet for a commons such as the atmosphere, unfortunately, we cannot afford to have free riding. I don't think we have the luxury of doing that. So that was the first thing that was mentioned. The second conversation that emerged from that was this idea that was presented by the submissions, both of Otile and my brother from Nigeria, in terms of the dissonance of different African countries arising from their energy sources. So, you know, we have countries that are reliant on, you know, on hydrocarbons to fuel their, you know, to provide their energy needs. You know, those hydrocarbons are huge revenue sources for the countries. There's a huge ecosystem all around it. It provides employment, it provides, you know, so that's one piece. And there are countries that are heavily reliant on, you know, more renewable endowments, you know, such as hydro, such as geothermal, just as, you know, just as solar and others. And so there is a bit of a tension there, which then invites us to this panel. And part of the first question I want to pose to my panel is, given this dissonance or these internal tensions arising from what I would call national interest dilemmas. How do we corral? How do we mobilize a common Africa position? And so I'll give each one of you guys a minute to introduce yourself, and then to move forward with responding to that question. Thank you very much. Let's start with Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, PS. And thanks to the audience and, of course, the government of Kenya here and the government of Germany as well for convening us in what has been a very open, rich, and in-depth discussion that we don't always have the chance to have. I think it's been a great idea to bring the Berlin Climate Security Conference to here and see how it's grounding in the discussions. So, in answer to your question, my name is Liz Carabine. I'm a climate security advisor with the UN Office of the Secretary General's Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa. So it's a regional position here in the Horn. So today we've seen quite a few contentious discussions. We see them whenever we convene on a kind of global level like this around climate and the very difficult issues of climate justice, the negotiations, the finance, etc. I can talk about maybe a positive slice that's been my experience in working towards a common position here on climate security with my colleagues here in the panel. It actually hasn't been difficult at all, I think is fair to say, to reach a common position on climate peace and security here in the Horn. And I say that if I describe a bit the process we've come through from a technical discussion. Again, the first time we're meeting each other back then for a technical discussion about, what is the issue, how should we address it, what do we know, what do we not know. From that first initial discussion, which was the first consultation on that technical level, it was abundantly clear that from community leaders, from peace builders, from the member states, ministries, various ministries, interior, environment, defense, foreign affairs, that a common position was a desire for this region. We understand this is a problem. We want to act, and we're ready to lay down a common position where other efforts at the global level are a bit too slow for us, not urgent enough, and we know what we want to say. We moved through the year with that guiding principle, really, to convene at the higher and higher levels, to the point we've had last month of having the heads of state of this region endorse the very same, call for a response and practical suggestions for having, a regional mechanism that would improve coordination, channel finance, and also improve the evidence base and all of our information. So in all of that work, with the colleagues here from African Union, from IGAD, from within the UN system, with all of the member states, especially Kenya, I should say, since you're with me, who are such champions of this issue, we've all been on the same page. So I think, let me just give you that good news story before we go into more detail. Maybe it's more difficult from a continental perspective.
Perhaps then, Dr. Prosper, you can continue on that trajectory. So she's very hopeful, which I think is really music to my ears, yes. But let's get more practical, let's get more realistic. Is that the real realistic position? Particularly as we head towards the Africa Climate Summit, but like to believe that we can come up with a real common Africa position, not just on paper, but in substance.
Well, thank you very much. Let me start by also thanking the government of Kenya, and of course also the German Foreign Office in Adelphi for organizing this wonderful program. Let me then respond to how do you mobilize that common position by saying that indeed we will be guided by the principles and the priorities. The idea of a common position is to have one voice, be united, and speak from what remains critical in terms of our interest to ensuring that climate change impacts have the desired adaptation, the issue of prevention, in terms of keeping people safe, addressing issues of loss and damage, the resilience aspect, and issues of mitigation. And so we need to be clear on certain things. And by the principles, perhaps the first one is clarity. Do we agree or accept that climate change has a linkage with peace and security? If so, we have to stop pretending. We just have to accept it, or the development on the ground in terms of the risks and the threats will let us know that we can no longer dodge this issue. What that means then is that we from the continent indeed agree, as per the decision made at the AU Assembly in February 2022, that there is a linkage, and that led to the call for undertaking an assessment study on the continent to ensure that it is clarified, the linkage is established, and based on that, then we can adopt, credible measures in terms of responses to this adaptation and mitigation issue we talk about. So clarity is essential. Secondly, I think that in terms of understanding, we need all to be on the same page. The third aspect has to do with the issue of inclusivity. No one country, no one person, no one organization can address the issue of climate change. Once the sun shines and those gases trap the heat, the ice will continue to melt. African island states will continue to be threatened. And so we need to ensure that everybody's collective effort would respond to climate change. Let's not make that mistake of thinking we leave Africa and so the boat will keep afloat. Any small hole will sink the ship. So whether they're asking the continent to channel its meager resources or finance in terms of responding to climate changes, which they could use for education, health, and other things, and then the funds doesn't flow, what that means is that you still have a defect. So if support comes in terms of financing, then we're able to also ensure that there's stability and people are better able to make this. Let me then just mention perhaps in terms of priorities, the fact that we have the issue of adaptation as very key. And in that regard, we're not negating the issue of mitigation, but adaptation is crucial, and loss and damage is important as a first step in the adaptation effort. So I'll end here. And then
Thank you very much, Dr. Prosper. Again, very, very interesting in terms of articulating the issue around clarity. So clarity around the cost of non-action. And the responsibility that devolves to all, because collective action in relation to this matter is not an option, right? We just have to make it happen. So, Dr. Linda?
Thank you very much. I'm Linda Ogalo from the Climate Center of Excellence you heard about earlier, IGAD's Climate Center of Excellence. And I think when we talk about the national or common African position, I have the privilege of sitting here on behalf of a big team. As IGAD, we have a technical working group on climate security that coordinates across sector. With Siwan being part of it, my colleagues from ICPALD, which is a livestock institute, colleagues that deal with land governance, our peace and security unit generally, people that deal with all different kind of issues that have been identified as priority for our member states. So even as we talk about a common position for us as IGAD is acknowledging, like Lisa says, that we've had this conversation at a member state level. So we need to, we've actually talked to our stakeholders. We've identified what they've said their priorities are, and as Lisa said, our position has actually been endorsed by our heads of state. So it then becomes easy for us to feed into the conversation with African Union to ensure that the positions that we've identified that are ours and that are core to us by our member states, by our technical experts, are reflected in whatever it is that's coming out of the African Union position. And the good thing about that is that Prosper and African Union team have involved the regional bodies to ensure that what we have to say in terms of representing not just our technical institution as IGAD, but our member states' positions as well, having consulted them and having those governments, because government again represents communities on the ground, so having those voices heard. So at least we know that we're creating a system that is able to reflect the community voice at the continental level and hopefully at the global level as well.
So I'm hearing you to be saying that the RECs, the regional economic communities or the regional groupings, could actually help in curating that common position so that based on the principle of subsidiarity, it can just feed to the AU level because it's already been agreed and there is sufficient consensus at the regional, at the sub-regional level. I think that's excellent, actually.
Yes.
I take it, you mean yes?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. Dr. Kenduyo, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I want to appreciate the government and the government of Kenya and Germany and also Adelphi for this opportunity. So I want to, our organization, I work for the CGIAR and we work within the food, land and water systems. We work to transform those three areas under a climate crisis. So one, we come from a point of view that we have acknowledged that indeed climate change is here and it is affecting, cutting across different areas of the globe equally, and therefore requires a united front in terms of combating it. So I would like to just acknowledge what has been mentioned here. I mean, we have engaged with partners and most of the partners are here. Some have met them here in the room. We've discussed the different, how climate is affecting the different areas. For example, looking at the Africa, one of the things I would like to pick from here, earlier members of the panel, is that it's important, even as we are seeking the one position, to pick up the different local context and picking those pathways and making sure that these have been represented within the common position. And therefore that is therefore important because it only comes by engaging with partners in this space, listening to them, and also because I'm a data scientist, I rely on evidence. So there's need also to rely on evidence to inform this position, to inform the reports that we come up with. And so we have gone ahead and even, I like to quote Hannah Tete, who mentioned that technical capacity is not an issue because as CGIAR, we even went ahead, we've launched a platform that can help in terms of tracking these issues. So the issue is now to pick up this different local context, inform them with evidence to come up with the local common position. That is probably in a nutshell what I would say, which is in many words the same as what my colleagues have said here. Thank you.
I think you've brought in a very important dimension in terms of, you know, like a tool that can aid in consensus building, which is always about evidence, about data, so that if we can be able to put on the table information to buttress certain positions in ways that are so persuasive, I think we can be able then to formulate a common position. So let's then move to the second part of our conversation, which is really founded on what I call the SEPs. So in May last year, May 2022, the Climate, Environment, Peace and Security Declaration was adopted by the G7 under the leadership of Germany. It has several principles and priorities. I think it has 7 key priorities. I think we've all, as panelists, perhaps reflected on these principles, and so the questions that will follow will really be based on those principles, but try as much as possible to link it to the core theme around how do we enable or facilitate a common African position that is responsive and transformative. So based on the discussions over the day and your experiences, which of the 7 declarations do you think should be the highest priority for this, for Africa? Let's start with you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thanks. And I think I'll answer in the sense that I think the ones I'll mention are the highest priority for the kind of work that I engage in, because of course they're all important. It's a very comprehensive set of principles that I particularly admire for spanning the political spectrum, but also the need for evidence sharing, knowledge, and proper integration into action of these issues. But for me, if I pick three that really define the kind of work we've just described, is around the aligning ambition and action, especially the ambition part in laying down a position, cooperation through dialogue. Of course, to reach this point where we've had a decision at the regional level, sub-regional level, made and passed through the member states and upwards to AU, has taken a lot of dialogue at every level, and political leadership. I think you saw it this morning. We couldn't really achieve those things as the technical actors in these big multilateral organizations without the leadership of our principles. Some of them weren't here today, but often they are, and that's what I think has really transformed the agenda from, I've 20 years working in the region on climate. This is something that I haven't seen before, where we can start through our institutions and between them to leverage our highest political leaders. And everyone here knows, those leaders are not necessarily mandated on the environment or, mine, for example, Hannah Tete, who you saw this morning, is a mandate to peace and security. Climate, peace and security has become a crucial element of that because of what we've seen in this region and because of the demands of member states. And this dialogue that we have around something that on which there's a lot of political convergence in this region, a lot of shared understanding and a lot of desire to address, also makes the space for the more difficult discussions that are very important for action. So we know, if you read IGAD's report on the state of climate, peace and security in the region, governance and fragility, political grievances, as well as the natural resource issues we've heard today, are the key barriers or pathways to successful action that are hindering us, if you like. So being able to have this platform, dialogue, common position on an issue that needs a regional response is of utmost importance, up to head of state level. Also allows for those, to address those more difficult discussions, especially in this region, on peace and security, governance, fragility, etc. And I think that's where it becomes a very powerful platform for a common position, not just for the COP, but on many different, important issues. Thanks.
Let me just quickly mention that perhaps the first one I'll talk about, which I hinted earlier on, is inclusivity. What I mean by that is that if you look at the AU Peace and Security Council communiques, that the communiques that called for developing a common African position, talked about the issue of a chairperson's report. Again, there was also conducting assessment study on the continent. All these would fit into a common African position. Why that? It requires assessing the situation, talking to people, the bottom-up approaches, and the top-bottom, to get an understanding of what is there that needs to be responded to. So inclusivity is key. The second aspect is coherence. Are we all working in an integrated manner, in a logical and consistent manner to address the issue? And so from the AU side, like my sister Linda said, we're working with all the stakeholders, all the actors to ensure that a common position reflects what the continent wants, so that when African group of negotiators go out there, they can speak to our interest to address the issue. The third aspect perhaps would be enforceability. We need to enforce some of the decisions we make. Too much talking does not solve the problem. We know what we need to do. And so if we're able to go on this issue of enforceability, I think it will be very helpful.
I think really important what you're saying, because it speaks to what the declaration, the climate, environment and security declaration talks about in terms of policy alignment, all the way from the international, regional, national and subnational level. And so you have really brought it out in a very granular fashion, I think. Please, Dr. Ogallo.
Thank you. I think I'm lucky because I get to speak after Elizabeth, so because we work together in the same region. So she gets to say all the right answers and then I just get to add to them. So, and I think as a region, we have been very clear, and she talked about the report about what our issues are, what the linkages are, what we want and how we want to respond to it. And I think that my other luxury is having to sit here as IGAD after some of our representatives, our heads of state, the Kenya government has spoken, and just to echo what they have already said in terms of the need for action, the need for the finances to flow, and the need for the finances to flow in a timely manner, in a way that they can actually constitute change. So for in terms of our common position, I think, and even just to mention the fact that we do have a lot of institutions, not just as IGAD, but as member states. I think His Excellency also mentioned the financial mechanism, FLOCA, that Kenya has, that is based on the Climate Change Act that Kenya has again, that is kind of an example of how the institutional infrastructure already exists to be able to channel the right finances to the last mile user, so to speak. So because FLOCA again is locally led and it's based on the county level action plans or climate action plans. It's based on the Kenya laws that are already in place. If we look at our neighbors, we can even take example from Rwanda, with the FONERWA fund that has actually attracted, they said, about $214 million in private sector financing. So we have a lot of examples from the region on what works. We already have from a lot of the region institutional structures that are already in place at the regional level, at the national level, and at the subnational level. That then begs to question, then can we, like our leader said this morning, accelerate climate finance to be able to meet the needs at the local community in a timely manner?
Again, a very important facet of the climate, environment, security, and peace declaration. The piece around financing is also very well articulated. You've helped us ground it, and I think it fits very well to, with what we're working on. Dr. Kenduiwa.
Thank you very much. I would like to share experiences as I also answer your question. And just last week I was with the, I was invited for the US Africa Command Security Implication of Climate Change Conference. And it was very interesting to sit with the military and understand how they are also responding to the impacts of climate change. And from that perspective, I realized that it is also important even as we move forward, because one, they mentioned that they are fast responders to these disasters, and that they are combating an enemy that is not conventional to their training. And one thing that was very important, or that I noted, is that they are currently, or whatever was being discussed, is bringing the aspect of the climate security risks in terms of now informing peace. Yeah, so the aspect of peace has changed from guns to now even working with communities and making them understand what has changed and how they need to prepare, from simple things as strategic planning of areas, placing equipment in areas that are likely to have impacts of either flooding or cyclones, or to have droughts, and then having mobile clinics, to those kind of things. So that is just an experience I thought I would share. Then there's been a lot of mention on finance during this conversation of the as we have been going on. And for that, I would like to go with number 2, that is mobilizing climate and biodiversity finance for peace. And there is one thing I would like to mention there, even as we seek a common position, there is a need to start looking at the project or the investments that we make in terms from a climate security investment planning. We need to prioritize areas that need this investment. In as much as, of course, we need finance, where do we channel that? When Kenya is given this money or when Africa is given this money, where do we channel that in these different areas? Which communities or which populations need this information the most, this kind of interventions the most. I would like to finish up with a very good example that was given here, that a project in Cameroon where wells were dug and then, a lot of investment was placed and people still go to the, to their normal business. So there's also a need to pick up the need to, engage knowledge sharing and bringing that into the capturing of a common position, and also going, having a peace-inclusive, peace-responsive programming. So if you want to do a project, engage communities, know what they want, and then, say that later on you don't have repercussions, because there is what we call maladaptation. We are currently asking for finances, but have we started prioritizing what needs, what interventions are needed where? So it's one thing we seek the African position. It's also one thing to also make sure that those programming really do not turn into potential conflicts instead of bringing the solutions that we were looking for. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think you've touched on several issues. What is most interesting is this whole idea of all of government approach, that climate is not something that is just nested at one State Department. Say it's not an environment problem. It's way bigger, and even militaries have a role in it. And that, I think, is a very unique thing that you've said. I'd like to throw this back to our very, very learned audience and get 2 or 3 questions from the floor, and then we will come back to you. Questions from the floor, first takers. I have number 1 there. I have number 2. Any other question? Final takers? That's number 1. Oh, so number 3. I know. So number 1, number 2, number 3. All right.
Thank you very much again. Mine is not a question. I want to add some few points to what Prosper has mentioned. I know we have worked a lot, Prosper, on some of these issues. One of the things that maybe you need to also highlight a little bit is the post-conflict reconstruction and development policy as far as climate security pillar is concerned. I know we discussed this in Accra, and it is something that is not being reflected even in debates like this. Maybe you would want to clarify more. I think we should expand on the African position and a common position on this issue. And in my view, I think I might be repeating some of the common positions you have already mentioned, like values, but I think we should have some more common position like respect. We all have our different approaches to climate security in the continent, and I think we should have some level of respect and understanding which is mutual. If we are sharing resources and we are utilizing it in the way that we believe it's to our benefit and to the position that we want, and according to our values, we should respect those values. So I think you might need to consider respect as one of the common positions. The second one is ownership. We should have a common position of ownership in terms of looking at the results, in terms of documenting good practices. And Africa probably have this opportunity to have its own ownership and be proud of what we have achieved. So ownership of both our processes and results. The third one is context matters. So we might not be having glaciers in Africa compared to what we have in Greenland, and that the context in fighting climate change in Greenland is probably different from what we have in the African continent. So how do we address the common position based on context, African context, regional economic context, national context, and specific context? For example, we can talk of northern Kenya compared to other areas like South Sudan, which is flooding, So these positions, I think, should be reflected as one of those common positions for Africa to stand and move along those directions. And we're talking about money this morning. How do we get money based on our context and hone our results and even put out what we want to own as our own results and put it out there and say, yes, this is what we want, and it should be respected in the negotiations. And thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Yes, madam.
Hi, Nazanin Mashiri from International Crisis Group. It was a similar point to what Dr. Sunday was making, but again, I just wanted to try to understand the difficulties in coming to a common position where you have such different contexts, where you have countries like Nigeria and South Africa who are, economically advanced, who are leading in terms of energy transition, and then you have countries like Somalia, where a tiny proportion of climate financing goes to Somalia and even South Sudan, countries that are at risk of conflict. How do you then come to a common position where some countries need grants and other countries want more favorable loans? So how then do you come to that common position on climate financing? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Final question, please.
Hello, yes. My name is Sarah. I work for the Cairo International Center for Conflict Resolution, Peacekeeping and Peacebuilding, CCCPA for short. We're the Secretariat of the COP27 Presidency Initiative, Climate Responses for Sustaining Peace, or CRISP. Our initiative basically focuses on 4 main pillars that address climate adaptation, peace building, food systems and food security for sustaining peace, climate displacement, and climate finance, or accelerating climate finance for sustaining peace. I would like to, the first question that my colleague mentioned here really resonates with what I was going to say about context specificity, and that interventions, and this is how we're basing the COP27 Presidency Initiative, context specificity, solutions or interventions and responses that really reflect African priorities, African narratives, and African voices. So the context specificity of such responses are integral and very, very important when we address the nexus of climate, peace, and security, and as well as avoiding implementation silos. So an integrated and a holistic approach to addressing these challenges and addressing the questions at hand are crucial, because the piecemeal responses and piecemeal one-off interventions kind of not only lead to a funding fatigue, but they also lead to an implementation fatigue. And really the full picture when it comes to such responses is key, I think. So my question here is on the regional level as well as the international level. How do you, from your point of view, ensure that such responses, that such criteria are maintained? So the context specificity, the national ownership of such responses, the integration of national African voices and narratives, and avoiding implementation silos as well. Thank you.
Very, very loaded questions for our panelists. I don't want to take their time. Let's start with Elizabeth. Take any of the questions and then we can roll forward. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm the first in the firing line. I'll answer a couple of them. Maybe first on the finance question, because I think it's the African Union has been very clear in distinguishing between a common position on climate for the negotiations and a common position on climate, peace and security, which is where we are. And I think it's worth making the distinction, because what you would discuss within the climate, peace and security position is more aligned with the, let's say, a subset of the adaptation and resilience discussion. And actually, thankfully, honestly, when you look at some of the more complex trade-offs and dilemmas which are in the mitigation and green growth space, of course there's overlaps, and we've heard from in the previous session and others, but it is quite important when trying to set out a clear narrative around this, and where there is consensus and where there is not, because both of those things exist even when you get to the COP. Between those two positions, finance architecture is pretty complex, and there is a tendency to focus on the very big international climate funds, especially because they're enshrined in the Paris Agreement, which is what the COP is all about. But there are many others, but there's absolutely gaps. And I think sometimes when we despair about where will we find climate finance for some of these, a Somalia example, if we would look to the Green Climate Fund, I think which I know we are, that's a long-term difficult goal. But there are other solutions that might not be there in place through bilateral finance, through other kinds of multilateral climate or related funds that sometimes get overlooked. And I think if we have a very clear overview of the architecture and where the gaps are, we also know, we heard this morning from the State Secretary what the targets are, from those who are replenishing these funds and so on. It's challenging. So, I think that we can match up the kinds of needs that are needed in one context and another, and have a very good dialogue, as we're having today, with those on the boards of some of these decisions, or who are trying to decide where big pots of climate adaptation money, for example, can go. What are the exact modalities that we can design, if they're not there, to get them to where they're flowing very well to the energy sector. We know that. Kenya's climate finance is 99% in the energy sector, which is excellent. But we can design other ones. I think on the issue of the how to ensure the context specificity and to avoid implementation fatigue, I'm just going to echo the words of my boss this morning. Ask the governments, local, who represent people. If we come in as UN, which is not unheard of, to decide this should be a priority in this context, and we'll have a discussion with government and we'll implement like this, you can certainly miss. You get the implementation fatigue, you miss the specificities, and you risk the kind of maladaptation that Benson just mentioned. If you work as closely as possible, hand in hand, in dialogue with a whole of government approach, or whether it's a regional counterpart, local government, national government, you should avoid that. It's actually not too difficult.
It's not too onerous, okay? Prosper. Yes. Let me just give us a bit of some prosperity. Yes, reinforce the clarity around the CAP, Common African Position. In 2008 or 2009, AU member states came up with a Common African Position on climate change. The Common African Position that the AU Peace and Security Council is requesting is that of the linkage between climate change, peace, and security. And there are various strands to that. As I talk in the AU Commission, there is even a Common African Position on energy. So the emphasis here is on climate change, peace, and security. That said, let me go to the other issue of the PCR, the post-conflict reconstruction and development. The whole idea is that in responding to climate change impacts, you have the direct and indirect linkages. And because climate change impacts lead to conflict, forced displacement, migration, and all these other issues, food insecurity, you can name them, we need to have some program in place to address these things in the communities. And it's about the women, the youth, the children, the IDPs, the vulnerable groups. And so the PCRD is supposed to prevent a relapse into violence and also address root causes of conflict. So this whole idea is that, given that there are impacts, we should have practical programs to respond to that. The third aspect on context specificity is then to say that the regions are varied, and like it was said, what may be happening in the south may not be the same in the north. And so when we are responding, we must take this or put this in context. And then you talk about the issue of climate finance and just transitions, so to speak. Just transition is simply to say that if you're using the fossil fuels and all that, shift to the green, those that make it environmental friendly. But the discussion and the politics had been that we who have been asked to stop using gas and all that, we see same people going back to the gas when there is conflict elsewhere. And so what is the position now? We need these things to develop. There are no alternatives. If we leave it, it's double tragedy. But if there are alternatives, we could shift gradually. So the concept of the just transition is to ensure that we develop at a pace that makes people comfortable, brings stability, while also enabling us to do alternatives. Okay, so it's in that context that we are talking about the just. It must be fair, there must be equity. Indeed, there are difficulties. Some countries will say, no, let's do this now. Let's stop all these carbon going into the air and all that, and let's just go green. But how can we go green if we don't have the technology, the know-how, the all the alternatives and all that? And so you see the challenges coming up, which is the response to the issue of the challenge. The challenges coming up in the area of coordination and cooperation. How do we then work together, perhaps even within the AU Commission, to get the desired impact? How do we work together as member states to get that common African position? And finally, to mention that we're working with CCCPA on the CRISP initiative, which is a COP27 presidency initiative in the area of climate change and peace building, and also climate financing and capacity building. All these are part of responses geared towards the adaptation and mitigation efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Prosper. Particularly, I think your call around what just transition means in our context, which is it should not be too abrupt. There should be some kind of transitions, and the whole idea is to build resiliency in energy, in energy supply and alternatives. I think you've used the word alternatives, which I think is really important. Dr. Ogallo.
Thank you very much. I think I began by saying I sit here on behalf of a lot of people, and which is kind of the answer to the question that we're talking about. The whole idea of the IGAD climate security coordination mechanism was not to create something new, but to recognize that this is an issue that is being dealt with by different people. Someone talked about a siloed approach, and how can we make the table big enough for everybody to sit in and bring in their own perspectives to address this complex issue that cuts across and cannot be addressed by one person. You cannot have an expert at everything climate security because the issues are very different. And usually, like when my colleagues, Dr. Sunday and I sit, we are completely different. Our understandings are different. So when we begin to have a very in-depth conversation about peace and security, I will tag him, and he's been to the communities and he understands it. And when it becomes too climate related, he tags it back to me, and I can begin to talk about the COP processes. And we have other colleagues as well, and that's what we need if we're going to be able to be able to address this in an inclusive manner, like Prosper said. Can we make room at the table for those who need to be here to ensure that all the views are being represented, such that when we are talking about a common position, it's not a perspective of Linda from IGAD, but it's a perspective of everybody else. So I think the solution is making room at the table for the different perspectives such that we can deal with it in a holistic manner.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ogallo, for those views, please.
Yeah, I think the panelists have made my job easier. I will just summarize to avoid duplication. I mean, as Linda said, even responding to issues around climate change is multi-sectoral. So, one, looking at it from a disciplinary perspective, you have to work with people. For example, within our team, we have qualitative and quantitative teams, just to begin with. And and you continue to integrate and you bring in partners and all these other things to get perspectives. So I wish to just note that, taking an African position does not rule out the regional and national engagements, which of course will continue. And also engagement even within the regional blocks, which will strengthen the voices to be heard on the other, because we have regional bodies, we have regional economic blocks, and you know, the list continues. So, you know, just to summarize, that's all I can bring in.
Thank you for unpacking that.
Thank you.
Thank you for unpacking that, Dr. Kenduiwa. So the Common Africa position, both yourself and Dr. Ogallo, I think, spoke about what that means, that it could be diverse. There is diversity even within the common, and that it's not exclusive, and that there is space, or there ought to be space for regional nuances, or for country sort of led approaches, you know, to sort of getting the same kind of results. But I'd like to conclude this panel, just giving each one of you guys a minute, just to summarize, but also look back again at the climate, environment, security and peace declaration, and ask ourselves, is there something missing that you think should have been there, even as you summarize? You've got a minute each. Let's go. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I don't think I would characterize it as a missing principle. As I said, I think they're quite comprehensive, and we can get behind them, many of us that I engage with. Maybe what's missing, and it was mentioned a bit this morning, is who's part of the discussion. And there's a big effort by Germany as the spearhead of the initiative, the G7, who signed it, and now 25 members, we heard this morning. You're also considering on the Kenya side. So when we have, what's maybe missing is the full set of voices that need to be there when you then look at the question of how do you enact these principles. So I think that's probably more where I would look for the gaps in areas to build. And also on that, what does always hamper us, I feel, is we are missing that overarching policy, if you like, you know? We are really growing from the bottom up, but we know that we encounter, you know, always that these silos and issues that we mention about finance even and about implementation do come down to the fact that the Paris Agreement is blind on this issue. We know the Security Council's, you know, addresses this issue, but we've failed to reach a common position, let's say, except on a mandate by mandate basis. And it doesn't really fall within any of the other big multilateral agreements where we need to come together and discuss. So that's changing, we see it. Egypt's leadership last year in the United Arab Emirates this year, through champions like yourself, you'll also do the same at your summit. You start to draw it together, but without that target, if you like, or very clear line of where we need to demonstrate our results, it still hampers us a bit as we try to organize ourselves in response to the challenge.
Thank you very much.
Prosper. Let me just end by saying that when the sun shines and it rains, we are all exposed to some kind of climatic factors. And the exposure is the risk we talk about. If there will be some negative impact, that is the threat, and that's the danger to all of us. So the people at the center of this are particularly the vulnerable groups, the women, youth, children, the IDPs, and all those who suffer. Climate change is a multiplier. There are existing problems, but it intensifies it. So what we're saying is that for us to respond effectively, we all need to collectively address the issue. And in the middle of it is the issue of the finance. If poor countries who have meager resources, which is not even enough for education, health, food, and all, are supposed to be using this same money to address climate change impacts, what happens? It's really a double tragedy, like I call it. And so we need to ensure that the financing comes to supplement what we do. And finally to say that right from the Committee of African Heads of States and Government, the CAUSC, through to the Ministerial Council, the Ministerial Committee, AMCEN, and then the African Group of Negotiators, to the AU Commission, the REX member states, we all in this working towards a common African position, and we hope that with that would have a collective interest to address towards peace and stability of the continent. Thank you.
Sorry, we're just consulting in the African spirit. Yes, Dr. Ogallo, please.
I think, like Liz has said, the limitation in the legal framework, for example, in how to operate, because the one thing that has been clear, if you've been in this space in the last year and a half, is the conversation on linking climate and security has increased in different avenues, so to speak. If you go to the food security arena, we're talking about it as a HDP nexus. In the migration arena, they're looking at the link between displacement and climate. He talked about the defense arena. So we're having this conversation, again, also in silos sometimes, but we talk about a whole of government approach, and the challenge with a whole of government approach that we're going to definitely face when we begin to have a programmatic response will be on mandate. So you have this conversation happening with the peace and security people. If you're talking about resilience and energy, so are they on board? Who's going to implement? Who's going to get the finance? Who's going to do what? Who's mandated to do what? And the infighting that comes when the money comes, that's definitely going to be a challenge. We're talking about the climate, peace and security position happening in EU with the peace and security division, but the climate change position generally happening with the agricultural division. So again, we have very clear ways in terms of how we operate that is very siloed, but we don't yet have, even when you talk about a whole of government approach, a way that we work together that kind of helps us navigate through our very strict mandate lines and dealing with a program that, or a problem that does not care about mandates, that cuts across disciplines, that tells us that if we don't do this together, we're not going to be able to solve it at all. So I think the challenge for us is to figure out, it's not just enough that we agree that this is an issue. It's going to have to be for us to figure out how then do we solve this issue from our different lines, and even though it might leave us out of the loop, so to speak. So I might be able to define the problem really well, but the solution might not be with me, and I need to be okay with that. So those are some of the difficult conversations that we might have when we start talking about implementation on the climate security agenda from a programmatic perspective.
Thank you very much. Doug.
Yeah, thank you. So for me, I think, one, I'm happy that these discussions are happening. So I come from the academia and also science, and one of the things that we do is sometimes we generate evidence at a very fast pace, and there's no supporting framework, as had been mentioned. And I'm hoping that there will be goodwill from government and related players to put this into commitments. So it's one thing to have the Africa Common Position, but it's one thing to pick from the African Union Common Position what is our commitment, for example, as Kenya, as IGAD in the region, and so forth. The other thing that I always say is that as we continue to look into or to face the threats that climate change poses, and now within the humanitarian development peace discourse, one thing I've realized that it's important to share information to inform decisions. I really don't want to add anything there. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our panelists. I think for me, there's probably one thing that I feel misses out on sort of on the priorities, and I think I would want a situation where the biggest or the greatest capabilities of humankind are brought to bear to deal with the biggest challenge that we have. And for me, I think technology and innovation is one of the things that I thought I wanted to see more of, when I looked at, at that declaration. And so that would be my piece. And so towards a common position on climate security for Africa, is it possible? I think the answer is affirmatively yes. How do we get there? We get there because or guided by very clear principles, by a very clear set of priorities, by a clear appreciation of the costs and benefits, by an appreciation that there are diversities even in the common, but most fundamentally by appreciating a complete imperative that it's something that we must all do together. We either, using your words of the sun shining, upon all of us, we either swim together or we sink together. And we really want to swim on this huge, vast ocean that the Creator has given us. I think we want to swim together. And so I want to thank again our panelists. Please join me and put your hands together for all these great people.